Hi, everyone. Welcome. We're just going to wait a minute for folks to join. Okay. In the interest of time, we're going to get started, but we are going to keep admitting folks into the webinar over the next couple minutes. Hi, everyone. Welcome. My name is Divya Sundar. I'm the Director of Research at Majority Action. I want to welcome you to our 2024 Proxy Season webinar, where we're going to be discussing director accountability at climate critical companies. And next slide, please, Laura. So here's our agenda for today. First, Bryant Sewell, our research manager, is going to talk about our climate voting guide. As you all probably know, Majority Action releases vote recommendations for directors at climate critical companies every year. Bryant is going to walk you through the methodology that we use for selecting industries and companies, for assessing climate performance, and for making voting recommendations. Then Jason Disteroft, our investment engagement manager, is going to talk specifically about director accountability at ExxonMobil, a company that, as all of you know, has been in the news a lot lately. We'll have some time for Q&A, and then we're going to close. Next slide, please. So just for some housekeeping first, as I mentioned, we will have time for Q&A at the very end. So please put any questions that you'd like to ask our speakers in the Q&A box, and we'll address them during the session. This webinar is being recorded, and you will get links to the recording and to the slide deck by email. Next slide, please. So I'm going to pass it off now to Bryant, who is going to talk about our climate vote guide.
Thanks, Divya. And I want to start by asking everyone to bear with me. The pollen count in the DC area is wildly absurd at the moment, so I'm a little bit congested. So sorry, I apologize for my voice. But yeah, thank you, Divya, and thanks everyone for being here. Next slide, please. I want to begin by plugging our proxy voting guide. And so this can be found on our website at the link right here. And as you can see, you'll be able to find specific to each company, our voting recommendations, and also as the proxy proxy guides come out, the specific director recommendations that we make at these companies as well. Next slide, please. All right, so to get started, I want to note that 2023 was the hottest year on record by a wide margin due to the record-shattering spike in global temperature. And it's against this backdrop that we've witnessed financial institutions backtrack on climate commitments, utilities propose fossil fuel as the solution to rising energy demand, and an oil industry that has grown bolder in its pushback to the net zero energy transition. This makes the 2024 proxy season a pivotal moment in which responsible investors must hold companies vital to the net zero transition accountable for their climate-related failures in the face of escalating climate risk. Next slide, please. So I'm going to start with the scope of Majority Action's proxy voting for 1.5C evaluation. And it includes a large subset of US-based companies where fossil fuel production and consumption are the core business model. And these are for the electric utilities and the oil and gas production companies. These are within the structure of the CA 100 plus priority companies. I also want to note, specific to the oil and gas industry, that we've limited the scope to upstream companies due to the outsized impact of Scope 3 emissions, which we believe are material to diversified long-term investors, because upstream investment decisions lock in cumulative emissions, incentivize demand, and siphon investment from sustainable alternatives. We also evaluate US-based financial services companies that have been identified as the top providers of lending, underwriting, and insurance services to capital-intensive fuel projects and companies, because as such, these companies are energy decision makers with the power to accelerate or stall the net zero transition. And on this slide, you can see those specific companies that I just mentioned in my notes. Next slide, please. Lastly, I want to note that our recommendations are informed primarily by the International Energy Agency's Net Zero by 2050 roadmap that lays out an economically productive scenario for the energy sector to achieve net zero emissions by 2050, thereby leaving open the possibility of limiting warming to 1.5 degrees C. Next slide, please. So beginning with the electric utility sector, Majority Action reviewed the climate disclosures of industry laggards against closely aligned CA100 plus net zero company benchmark metrics that we consider to be red lines that trigger votes against directors. These large publicly traded electric utilities remain among the largest sources of carbon emissions in the US economy, and their capital expenditure plans and fossil fuel-based electric power infrastructure have the potential to lock in greenhouse emissions for decades to come. Furthermore, decarbonization of electricity production also enables increased electrification efficiencies that can decarbonize the transportation and building sectors. As such, we focus on target setting and emphasize a net zero ambition as indicated by the CA100 plus, as assessed by the CA100 plus disclosure indicator number 1 that you can see right here, and medium-term GHG reduction targets, as you can see, emphasized by disclosure indicator number 3. Furthermore, we assess companies' alignments of capital expenditure, specifically coal and gas plant capacity, against the announced pledge scenario, which equates to a 1.7 degree scenario. And so we then evaluate it against a pathway. And that is taking into consideration the long-term trajectory towards 1.5C and companies that have made progress and a movement and a downward trajectory towards 1.5C, and allowing for that continued downward improvement in relation to the announced pledge scenario that nations have made. Furthermore, with respect to policy engagement, we assess real-world policy alignment based on the influence map assessment that is provided in the CA100 plus benchmark assessment. Next slide, please. The energy sector remains overwhelmingly off track to decarbonize, and according to analysis by Carbon Tracker, the world's largest oil companies have projects both sanctioned and unsanctioned over the course of the next 2 decades that would exceed the carbon budget for limiting warming to 2 degrees Celsius, let alone 1.5 degrees Celsius. And so while the IEA and many leading climate researchers agree on the need for limited new development of proven resource reserves to meet constrained demand scenarios, there's broad agreement that no new long lead upstream oil and natural gas projects are necessary as demand for oil and natural gas peaks in this decade, even without demand pressures from new climate policies. As such, we put particular emphasis on medium-term target alignment with an announced pledge scenario pathway, because to get to 1.5C, we'll need to see a significant drop in oil and gas production in the coming decade. So from the 2030s on, production has to meet the projected demand decrease that we'll be witnessing as oil and gas demand peaks in this decade. Next slide, please. On to financial services. And so I want to reemphasize the fact that these companies that have been identified as the top providers of lending, underwriting, and insurance services to capital-intensive fossil fuel projects and companies. As such, these companies have a crucial role to play in the decarbonization of those and other sectors. So beginning with banks, a 1.5C outcome is only attainable under a scenario in which fossil fuel investments are limited to existing oil and gas assets and already approved projects, as I mentioned previously when discussing the oil and gas sector. Evaluated commitments and policies of the financial sector. We evaluated the commitments and policies of the financial sector against widely accepted industry standards. And so for the banks, we looked at the IIGCC standard and series and the TPI assessment of these companies. So moving on to, and so we also want to emphasize, I also want to pause to emphasize the necessity for banks and our emphasis on absolute and intensity derived targets for oil and gas industries, for oil and gas industry companies, because intensity only targets are insufficient because oil and gas companies can reduce emissions intensities while still increasing hydrocarbon output, which is out of line with the IEA's decarbonization pathway for the energy sector, in which oil and gas products are replaced by ever cheaper renewables. So moving on to the insurance companies, insurers are in a position to, oh, sorry, can we go back one slide? Thank you. It's, the notes right here. Insurers are in a position to support the transition to net zero economy by applying their influence as risk managers, risk carriers, and institutional investors to reduce greenhouse gas emissions. Within the industry, we've seen high level commitments to act in the form of net zero ambitions, and accordingly, the next step towards enhanced accountability involves measurement and disclosure of insured emissions. As of November 2022, PCAF had developed standards for measuring these insured emissions that insurance companies can apply and disclose to investors. However, today, only AIG has partially disclosed its insured emissions, and therefore, you'll note we make recommendations against directors at these companies for not taking this next critical step, as I mentioned, towards enhanced disclosure. And next slide, please. So these slides, I'm gonna basically walk through the outcome of our evaluations. And so you'll be able to see the process and the steps that we took to get to the conclusions that were made here. So beginning with the electric utility sector, you can see here that, as I mentioned before, we took indicator 1, indicator 2 into indicator 3 into our evaluation, and the outcomes are the companies listed here. And you can see the companies that actually fail, primarily around incorporating vital scope 3 emissions into their target setting. And so those companies are listed here, from Berkshire Hathaway to Dominion Energy, noting Dominion Energy's failure is with respect to its medium-term targets. Also, particularly capital allocation. I mentioned for our evaluation purposes, we apply the notion that CapEx plans beyond the 1.5C scenario at this moment represent a significant risk in terms of the projected emissions from those decisions. And one company in particular, outside of those companies that are already failing in target, American Electric Power failed in that regard. Similarly, policy influence is extremely vital, and these companies, Duke Energy, First Energy, and PPL, were failing and labeled as misaligned, receiving a grade below a C- by the influence map assessment. Next slide, please. Yeah, so the oil and gas sector, as I mentioned, is critically off track. And you can see here, these companies, ExxonMobil and Occidental Petroleum, we evaluated them and came to the conclusion that they don't have comprehensive medium-term targets, as I mentioned, as critical, noting the demand projections for oil and gas into the next decade, and the fact that they're projected to peak this decade. That represents significant oversupply that, as I mentioned, incentivizes, it encourages the wrong incentives to continue our increased emissions that generate significant climate risk for investors. One company, as you can see, ConocoPhillips, they have set targets, but they don't include Scope 3 emissions in those targets. And Chevron, actually, as I mentioned, as noted here, has set targets that do include Scope 3 emissions, but they are wildly out. They're wildly out of line with a 1.5C or a 1.7C, let alone a 1.5C trajectory. And moving quickly to the banks and insurance companies. Next slide, please. So you can see here, again, we're evaluating the banks against their financed emissions targets, and noting that those should be in absolute and intensity terms. And the only companies to not do so are Goldman Sachs and JP Morgan. Equally important, Bank of America actually backtracked on its exclusion policies. And so they now are the only bank that doesn't have exclusion policies for fossil fuel services for services to fossil fuel companies and projects that are extremely carbon intensive. As I mentioned, the insurance company, with respect to insurance companies, you can see here the outcome of our assessment, where these insurance companies listed here have not taken the critical step to disclose their insured emissions, despite the methodology being available to them in the form of that PCAF has developed for over a year. Next slide, please. So it's our belief that voting on director elections at companies vital to the net zero transition is the most direct outcome long-term investors with broad market exposure can take to influence corporate decision-making and protect the value of their portfolios as a whole from climate change impacts. So as such, you can see at companies where we recommend against all directors on the board, that's for the for companies that are companies where fossil fuel production and consumption is the core business. And in this case, specific to oil and gas companies, they have not set critical medium-term targets. Also, with respect to the companies that are where fossil fuel is the core business, and they have failed in other areas of our 1.5C assessment, we recommend against the chair, lead director, and/or responsible director of the committee responsible for climate oversight. Lastly, I just want to note that at companies, banks and insurance companies, we specifically recommend against the relevant committee chair, with responsibility for climate oversight. And next slide, please. And I just wanted to leave this here. So as I mentioned before, on our website, we have not only the companies, but the directors that we recommend against specifically. And so I just noted the examples here because we actually review proxy statements, committee charters, and TFC disclosures to make sure we're identifying the directors with climate oversight at these companies that I've mentioned. And I will wrap it up there and hand it over to my colleague, Jason.
Thanks so much, Bryant. And thanks to everybody for joining. So this next section of the webinar will focus on arguably the single most climate critical issuer in the 2024 proxy season, and that is Exxon. So next slide, please. In our view, votes against responsible directors at Exxon are warranted this season on two grounds. First, climate fundamentals, and second, the threat that Exxon's actions pose to shareholder voice. So I'll say a bit about each of those topics, building on what Bryant has already laid out. Next slide. So first, we should just remind ourselves how important Exxon is in terms of climate risk. In 2022, it produced the most oil and gas of any investor-owned company by a 24% margin, according to Rystad. Since the Paris Agreement, it has been the greatest producer of carbon emissions among investor-owned firms, according to the new Carbon Majors report. So Exxon is a uniquely important contributor to climate risk, and what it does or doesn't do to mitigate that risk is absolutely crucial. Next slide. So what has it done or not done? Well, as is well documented, Exxon has known about the risks of climate change for decades. But rather than tackle the challenge of becoming a 21st century energy company ready to play a role in a net zero economy, it has doubled down on fossil fuels while continuing a long-standing strategy of denial, disinformation, and delay. Next slide, please. So Exxon's projections of demand for oil and gas are really outliers. They exceed even the IEA's slowest transition scenario, the stated policy scenario, in which, as the IEA notes, temperature increase hits 2.4 degrees Celsius by the end of the century. No other investor-owned oil and gas company has comparable demand projections. And the IEA projects demand to peak before 2030. Next slide, please. But Exxon's demand projections shouldn't be understood as neutral or disinterested. Instead, via its climate policy engagement, Exxon is trying to make those projections a self-fulfilling prophecy. As part of the CA100 Plus net zero benchmark, Influence Map grades ExxonMobil's real-world climate policy engagement at D-, misaligned, and characterizes it overall, as you see on this slide. Next slide. And Exxon's capital expenditure is aligned with those demand projections. Again, as part of the CA100 Plus benchmark, Carbon Tracker assesses Exxon's future investments as 70% incompatible with the IEA's announced pledges scenario, which is a 1.7 degree scenario. So it's Exxon's CapEx is significantly more incompatible with 1.5 degrees. Next slide, please. And finally, Exxon's targets are likewise aligned with those demand projections. Its 2030 expectation is for a 20 to 30% reduction in scope 1 and 2 intensity only, which means nothing on scope 3, nothing on absolute emissions. And reductions in emissions intensity are insufficient, of course, because they are compatible with increases in absolute emissions. The C100 Plus benchmark assesses Exxon's medium-term targets as not meeting any criteria on all three of its key points. So Exxon's failure to align its targets, capital expenditure, and policy influence with the goals of the Paris Agreement warrant votes against the full board, as Bryant has already noted. Next slide. But this season, investors are rightly equally concerned with Exxon's extraordinarily aggressive lawsuit against two of its own investors, which poses a grave threat to shareholder voice. In January, Exxon, instead of using the standard SEC no-action process, sued Arjuna Capital and Follow This for filing a proposal requesting that the company accelerate its medium-term emissions reductions. Exxon decided to continue the lawsuit even after the proponents withdrew the proposal. Next slide. This is an attack on shareholders, the proposal process, and the SEC, and it threatens serious consequences for investors' engagement with companies on crucial issues, including, but not limited to, climate risk. And Exxon's proxy statement out last week singles out by name and attacks ICCR, Proxy Impact, and As You Sow, as well as Arjuna and Follow This. The proxy also divides share owners into two classes, quote, our investors, and quote, other shareholders, and claims that only the former should participate in shareholder democracy. Next slide. But proposals filed by small shareholders often drive vital changes to corporate practice. In the past 3 years, 6 proposals filed at Exxon by smaller shareholders got more than 30% support, and 3 got majority support. Shareholder proposals drove making director independence, board declassification, and proxy access the norm in corporate governance. So ExxonMobil's lawsuit sets a dangerous precedent for other companies who may seek to sidestep the SEC and litigate instead. It is encouraging to see that prominent members of the investment community have already spoken out against Exxon's attacks on shareholders, including CalPERS trustees and staff, and Illinois State Treasurer Michael Frerichs. Westpath has also announced, including at the recent ICCR conference, that they will be running a Vote No campaign at Exxon this season. And CII has issued a statement defending the role of the SEC. So Exxon's lawsuit should be seen as both the latest chapter in Exxon's overall strategy of denial and delay, and part of a larger effort by fossil fuel interests to prevent investors from factoring common sense climate risks into investment decisions. Next slide. So two directors bear particular responsibility for Exxon's failure of corporate governance. Joseph Hooley, in his role as lead director, where one of his duties includes engaging with shareholders, and Darren Woods, chair and CEO. So majority action sees holding directors accountable at Exxon as a crucial response this season. And additional steps could include pre-declaring the intention to vote, ideally via an exempt solicitation, but otherwise via other mechanisms. And we would also urge investors to engage their asset managers and other service providers on this crucial vote. Thanks.
Thank you so much, Jason and Bryant. So we are in the Q&A portion. We do not have a ton of time. So what I'm going to do is just pick out one or two questions, and then we will follow up with folks who've asked questions that we're not able to get to. So one question I wanted to ask is, and I'll pose this to Bryant, how do we know if voting against directors for failing to meet climate standards is actually effective?
That's a great question. And so majority action has taken efforts to ensure that our recommendations are, as we mentioned, as I touched upon, the efficacy of our recommendations are rooted in the IEA's net zero by 2050 pathway, and rooted in the fact that this is the most critical and vital way to hold companies accountable for aligning capital to that 1.5C pathway. So we've seen the progression and the continued downward trajectory with respect to the support that directors at companies that are most misaligned have received, and specifically those directors that we've made recommendations against. On the flip side, we've also seen an increase in support, for directors at companies where they have progressed towards 1.5C alignment. So last year, we actually removed companies off the list like PPL, Next Era Energy, and others, and for their progression, as I mentioned, towards 1.5C pathway. And that actually corresponded, we noted, with the increase in support that those directors received. So we continue to see that trend being the case for these directors. And it's critical that investors understand, with respect to all the tools available to them in their toolkit, that these director votes do matter and are taken seriously, and through anecdotal conversations I'm sure we've had and others have had with consultants or directors, or through direct engagement that folks have had with companies themselves. They're taken seriously by those directors and seen as meaningful.
Jason, is there anything you wanted to add?
I think Brian hit the key points. There was one useful reference here is a Wall Street Journal article from a couple of seasons ago that looked into this in a comprehensive way, and we can certainly share that out as part of follow-up. But it mentions, among others, the example of PPL, which at that point was a laggard, hadn't set a net zero target, and a key director got quite low votes against, or sorry, quite high votes against. And the company set a net zero target, and those votes rebounded the following year. So there's a pretty clear mechanism that we've seen work in the past.
Great, thank you. And as Jason said, we will share that link out in the follow-up. Laura, can we go to the next slide? So yeah, unfortunately, we don't have time for any more questions. But again, if folks do have questions, please email us and we'll set up some time to talk with you individually. I'm just going to close us out. I know we're a little bit over. So as you might know, Majority Action publishes 2 vote guides every year, one focused on climate, which we talked about today, and one focused on racial equity. So we want to invite you to also use our racial equity vote guide, which primarily focuses on shareholder proposals, but this year is also looking at director votes at companies that are lagging in racial and ethnic board diversity. Next slide. We also want to invite you to an upcoming webinar that our racial equity team is organizing in partnership with United for Respect and Americans for Financial Reform. This webinar will focus on 2 shareholder proposals that are being advanced at Walmart, a racial equity proposal, a racial equity audit proposal, and a workplace safety proposal. And you'll have the opportunity to hear directly from Walmart workers, as well as labor advocates and investors. Next slide, please. And finally, this slide just reviews some of the different action items that you can take. We invite you to use our proxy voting guide, investors to hold your directors, at climate critical companies accountable, especially at Exxon, and asset owners to talk to your asset managers about how they can use our vote guides and leverage director votes. And if you have any questions or want to schedule a call with Majority Action, we invite you to email us at investors@majorityact.org. So that closes our 2024 proxy season webinar. Really want to thank you for staying with us. I know we went a little bit over, but thank you so much and have a wonderful day.